The fact is that climate change is the mother of all injustices. This is the moment precisely to stay strong, stand tall, and say, we do have, and we do, Shoma. We have the human ingenuity, we have the technologies, we have the finance, we know what the policies are. Honestly, there's no excuse. There is no excuse for not doing the right thing.
Hi, I'm Shoma Chaudhury. Thanks for watching Enquiry. The unconscionable tragedy of Afghanistan has been dominating the news. But at the same time, there's another kind of war zone that needs urgent attention. Over the last few months, we've seen catastrophic weather events, heat waves in Canada, fires in California, floods in India, Germany, Belgium, drought in Madagascar. No one in their right mind can ignore these signs. Now, this week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published its report and declared code red for the world. Global temperatures have risen by 1.1 degree beyond pre-industrial levels. If it rises to 2 degrees and beyond, our lives, to put it mildly, will be living hell. Now, the IPCC report says, for the world to maintain its temperature below this 2-degree mark, we will have to cut our emissions by 50% in the next 10 years. So is the human race ready for this? Have countries, citizens, and corporates woken up? Is there any scope for optimism? I'll be discussing all of that with an extraordinary guest on Enquiry this week. Christiana Figueres is one of the world's most influential climate diplomats. After the spectacular failure of the Copenhagen talks in 2009, as UN climate chief, she was tasked to bring the world back to its senses. Over the next 6 years, she negotiated and talked with 195 countries and brought them back to the negotiating table to sign the historic Paris Agreement in 2015. She now runs a foundation called Global Optimism, and as the world is gearing up to meet in Glasgow in November, we are really privileged to have her perspectives on the climate emergency. Thank you very much for joining me, Christiana.
Thank you, Shoma. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So, Christiana, you're known for being the climate diplomat that brought 195 countries to the table after the Copenhagen talks had, failed. But before I get into all of that and the new IPCC report, I wanted our audience to know what brought you into contact with climate consciousness and the urgency of this whole issue.
Well, actually, I would say that I came into climate change through the left-hand door, not through the front, which is my commitment to justice and to especially the justice between generations, the justice between what we as one species are doing to the other species that are sharing this earth with us, the justice between the global north, the global south, the justice actually even between the bigger haves, those who have more in any singular country, and those who have less. The fact is that climate change is the mother of all injustices. And whether that is gender, whether that is regional divisions, whether that's generation, whether that is the different forms of life on this planet, from whatever way you see it, it is the mother of all injustices. And because of that, I have chosen to dedicate my life to that.
So, Christiana, like I said, I'm going to come into the massive impact you had on all of this and the discourse and how important your intervention has been. But just again, for those who don't feel drawn into this conversation, I read somewhere that, you're just becoming aware of this there's often this idea that if you bring more gender justice, if there's more gender equality, there'll be greater awareness and responsibility towards the planet. And I was intrigued to read a small incident about that around the time you had your second child, you became aware of just how much was being lost. So can you just share that little personal anecdote before we move into the bigger issues?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's when I first became aware of what was going on with life on the planet. Because I was a young mother. I had my 2 children way too quickly, one after the other.
I share that boat with you. But
okay, there you go. I think there are many women who have that. And prior to that, when I was a young teenager, because I come from a political family, I had accompanied my parents basically to every corner of our tiny little country in Costa Rica on either the political campaign or, because of some other policy activity. And I had seen, and I think this is the story that you referred to, Shoma, I had seen a little golden toad that was endemic to one of our many national parks, and was absolutely thrilled with this amazing species that was just absolutely spectacular. It was a work of art. And when I was a young mother and I wanted to begin to introduce my daughters to nature as I had been introduced by my parents, I was appalled to find out that that species had literally gone extinct. It doesn't mean that the population that lived in Costa Rica went extinct or was lost. It means the species, because the species had only existed in Costa Rica, and the entire species went extinct in 1989. And I was really appalled, because I thought, if I, in, my short 30-something years, have witnessed the extinction of one species, that actually means that there are many more species that are going extinct without me knowing, either here in Costa Rica for sure, but definitely in the rest of the world. And I really thought that is not the terms of reference of any parent, certainly of not any mother. We are here to give our children a world that is better than that we have received, and not a world that is worse and more fragile. And so it was out of my sense, as I say, of responsibility as a parent, and justice between generations, and justice with the other living beings on this planet, that I said, whoa, what is this? And what do I have to do to begin my, what then turned out to be a life journey?
And, just to emphasize that point, and I think this is factually correct, that I believe we're losing 200 species every day. That's just like a staggering figure.
And those are the species that we know, Shoma, right? I mean, to that, we have to add how many species that we have not yet discovered, either flora or fauna, that we're losing without ever having recognized them. And that is both land and water. So that number could easily be much worse.
So that brings me, to your absolutely spectacular intervention. It wouldn't be hyperbole if I said you're kind of single-handedly saved the planet in a way, So you took on this very, very difficult job after the Copenhagen talks had failed. All the countries had gone away, no one was agreeing. And then in a short span of 5 or 6 years, you brought 195 countries back onto the climate table. And, they all agreed to sign a legally binding agreement. So looking back, Christiana, if you were to kind of isolate just one thing that really helped you create this turnaround, what would that be? What did you do?
Well, first, Shoma, I just wanted to refer to your term of saving the planet, because I think it's very important to understand that the planet is not going to be saved, and also doesn't need to be saved, because the planet has been around for 4.5 billion years, way before we ever appeared here. And she will continue, even if we are stupid enough to create circumstances that make it uninhabitable for the human species to continue to multiply and thrive. The planet will continue, definitely in altered form, but she has had many altered forms that are different to what we have now in the past, and she can easily have it in the future. The one thing that we are concerned about is not what the evolution of the planet is going to be in general, but rather, is that evolution going to be one that continues to embrace human species life? That's the question. Because we will, clearly have evolution of other species for sure, and we're already seeing that. But will it be a planet in which we can continue to live in the full realization that it's only been a very short 12,000 years where we have had the stability to be able to multiply and thrive and create the civilization that we have today. Clearly, there was civilization before, but modern civilization is the product of the past 12,000 years. So, so that, just to put it into context, right, that this really is, and we tend to think about,
Actually about us, it's not
we tend to think about saving the polar bears and saving the Amazon forest. Yes, all of that is important, but it's important to us because it is the natural context in which we have actually grown as a human species. But back to your question, there were many things that changed between 2009, when we had the Copenhagen debacle, and 2015, when we had the Paris success. And so let me just, quickly go through a couple of them. First, there were geopolitical changes that were really critical, that the United States and China decided to work with each other as opposed to against each other on this issue that they understand to be larger than the two of them was critical. The fact that we had so many solution technologies, including renewable energies, that came down precipitously in cost and were then all of a sudden rendered competitive against the legacy technologies was hugely important. The fact that we began to see that many of those solutions represent gain and not necessarily pain was also hugely important. But underneath all of that, I think the big shift was the realization of every country, every city, every geography, that actually this is in our enlightened self-interest. There is no human existence, whether that's an individual human, a family, a city, a country, whatever, that is benefited by a planet that is burning up, by a planet where we can no longer breathe, that by a planet where there is either so much flooding or so many fires that we can no longer coexist. And so the fact that we finally understood that we all share this one home, and that it is in our enlightened self-interest to work to regenerate what we have destroyed, was pivotal to the Paris Agreement, and the fact that every country understood that they do have a self-interest in this. Yes, of course, some have a short-term self-interest in continuing to exploit or sell or use fossil fuels, but despite that, we all have a shared interest in moving beyond fossil fuels.
So, that kind of brings me to the IPCC report that just came out, Christiana. So, 2015, 16, when the Paris Agreement was signed, there was just so much hope, so much optimism. In fact, I've been struck by whether it's Jane Goodall or you or Naomi Klein, or just, a lot of really very invested voices in climate change who've really been involved in the process. Even someone like David Wallace Wells, who really wrote a book which was spelling doom. I just did a conversation with him, and there's a distinct sense of optimism, that things are changing, things are like headway is being made. And yet the IPCC report actually spells out code red. Paris Agreement was about reducing emissions by 2050. Now it's it's so urgent that we've got to cut it by 45% by 2030, which is barely 10, 11 years away. So do you feel the same 9 years away? Yes. Do you feel the same optimism? Do you think enough has happened in this, or did the US pulling out under President Trump really set the whole process back?
No. The fact that the US pulled out temporarily for those 4 years didn't set the process back, because the fact is that at least 60% of the economy of the United States continue to decarbonize because they understand that is in their self-interest, and they live in a democracy, and sooner or later that leadership would change. So they fully understood that. I think there's a bigger issue here at hand, which is the very understandable straitjacket that we all wear and act from, which is the straitjacket of what we have done in the past and what we know. And so to break away from that straitjacket and step into virtually unknown territory and begin to reach out for technologies that are still relatively new and behaviors that are new and political decisions and investments that are new is understandably difficult, because any break from status quo is always, at any level of the system, at the individual level, you try to take on a new habit in your daily life. It's very difficult. And it's equally or much more difficult to break away and establish a new habit at the national level or at a city level. So it's a very human reaction to this. And yet, we certainly know with the IPCC that we are much shorter on time than we thought, that the damages of climate change are not just increasing, but they're increasing exponentially. And this is the confirmation of what science has been telling us for the past 3 years. But now this is the absolute confirmation that we do have to get to half emissions, that is 50% of the current level, by 2030. And that means industrialized countries have to make more of an effort in order to leave room for developing countries to do their half. So, the 55% that the European Union has now committed to is basically what we should expect from industrialized countries, that they do a 55% cut by 2030 in order to allow us as developing countries to do a 45%, and then on average, we can get to a 50%. And that does seem like a not just logical, but a fair assignment of homework between the global north and the global south.
So, Christiana, two of the sort of really intractable aspects, difficult aspects of all climate negotiation is, one is this inequality between the developed countries and the developing countries, the accountability and responsibility, those who've emitted more and those who are suffering more. And the fact that yet we all need to actually curtail emissions now. So, how did you get around that? Can you talk about some of the most thorny issues that you faced when you were trying to bring everyone back to the table? Give us some examples of how you got around it, how you molded it. And the second is about the economic viability of this, but I'll come to that later. If you can just talk about a couple of turnaround stories on this thorny issue.
Yeah, and I think you're pointing to a still golden principle of the climate convention since the start, since 1992, and that hasn't changed. And that principle is the primary responsibility of those who are most guilty of having caused climate change, which is the global north. And that is understood within the climate community and the climate legal system as historical responsibility. And there was in 2015 several attempts to wipe out that historical responsibility, wipe it out from the text, and not respect that. And that was clearly resisted by the global South, India being one of the most staunch on that. And it was very clear that there's no way that you can redo and rewrite history. History is what it is. Math is what it is. Physics and chemistry are what they are. And there's no doubt that the global north was responsible, because at least up until 1995, that is used as the reference year for most emissions, there's no doubt that up until then, most of the emissions, 70-something emissions 70% or so, came from the global north. So there is no doubt that a historical responsibility continues to be and shall always be a golden principle of the convention and of any legal instrument such as the Paris Agreement under the convention. So all efforts to eradicate that were really, completely, non-starters, because there was no country in the South that was willing to sacrifice that, understandably so. Now, period, next sentence in the same paragraph, if you will. One thing is historical responsibility that we cannot erase and should not. But equally important and in the same standing is future responsibility. And in future responsibility, we all have to step up. Because while it is true that the large emerging countries of the South are becoming leaders in emissions, it's also true that every other economy, my tiny little economy of Costa Rica being a good example, also has a part in the responsibility. And so to understand that you don't have to wipe out historical responsibility, but you do have to step up to your future responsibility. It was a very important turning point. In fact, that we did not in Paris, but 1 year before in Lima. It was in Lima that COP 1 year before, 2014, where we were finally able to figure out how do we put both of those types of responsibility that obey very different realities, but that are complementary and equally important. How do we actually put them side by side? And that was critically important then as a fundamental foundation for the agreement of the Paris Agreement. Now, fast forward, I should also say that that whole conversation that needed to be had was operating out of the assumption that decarbonization is not just a responsibility, but a burden. And as we fast forward today in 2021, we understand that decarbonization continues to be a responsibility, but that it is not a burden. It is actually an opportunity, because those countries that are able to decarbonize their economy will have more livable cities, better, healthier air, less polluted air, better public health, better transportation, more effective agriculture, more, better crops, et cetera, et cetera. So there are many, many benefits that come from the decarbonization, and something that we understood as being a responsibility that or a burden that had to be fairly distributed among shoulders is now understood as an opportunity that we can't afford to lose.
Yeah, I mean, again, to just emphasize for the audience, I've been just reading these really staggering statistics, which is that 24% of the global population is now more exposed to flooding than it was before. That's literally 1/4 of the globe. And in India, we are at massive risk. 33 countries that actually only account for 9% of global emission are the most at risk. The 10 top countries that are responsible for 70% of the emission are at lowest risk. So, all of that, and you've been repeatedly saying, especially after the IPCC came out, that this is the most decisive decade in humanity, and typically people who don't really yet have tuned into the urgency of the climate change debate see all of this as exaggeration and hyperbole, So for those in the audience who don't buy into this, how would you convince them that this is the most decisive decade? Why is it that way?
Well, a couple of things. I think first, you just have to be aware of the news to see how these extreme weather events are multiplying, both in their geography as well as in their frequency, and in fact, even in terms of their intensity. So that's, that is undeniable by now. Secondly, the science has been very clear about the fact that we have delayed action so long that we are really now standing before a precipice. And, one of my favorite, I think, in little pictures, if you will forgive me, and my favorite little picture for this is we've been filling the bathtub with water, the bathtub being the global atmosphere and the water being the symbol for CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And we are so much from getting to the brim of the bathtub. We are barely below the edge, and we can still fill up. But if we go beyond that brim, beyond that edge, then the water overflows and there's no containment. And that is what science is telling us. Science is telling us, look, you are just barely able to stay below that edge where if you go beyond it, there would be no containment, because then we have ecosystems that very abruptly transform into other kinds of ecosystems, and that starts a cascade of ecosystem transformation that we as humans just don't have the capacity to adapt to, because we do adapt, obviously, but very slowly. Almost all other species in the world adapt much more quickly to changing natural conditions than we do. In that sense, we're just spoiled. We're spoiled brats, as my mother would say, because we have had the continuity and the stability of natural conditions for 12,000 years. And so for us as a species to adapt to much hotter temperatures, to much less water in our lives, is going to be extremely difficult. And it would take thousands of years for the species to adapt, whereas other life would either adapt or go into extinction. So it is what science has been very clear in sharing with us and in alerting us to, is that by the time we get to 2030, we have to be at 1/2 the global emissions, as we have discussed. And that doesn't solve the problem. What that does is it just keeps the door open to then continuing the decarbonization process until we're at net zero by 2050, meaning we would not be emitting more than we're naturally absorbing. So it is that, therefore, known now as the most decisive decade, the decade of the 20s, really recognized by everyone as the most decisive decade in the history of humankind, without any hyperbole, to use your word.
So tell me, Christiana, typically there was always this sense that the global south, the poorer countries, the poorest people will be the ones who suffer the most. And it's a cynical question, but it's quite often easy for those who are leading a gilded life to kind of blank out the poor and those who are really suffering, the working classes. So now that the global north has itself, California, the absolute peak of wealth, and Silicon Valley, is facing terrible forest fires. Canada's like facing such an extreme heat wave. You have Germany flooded, you have snow in Texas. It's just like the apocalypse is so visible. Australia has been burnt down, thousands and thousands of kilometers. So the first world and the global north is really seeing it up close. You're so connected with the political community. Do you see that? Has that added any urgency? Is that having any impact on the conversation and the commitment to this?
Yes, I think so, and I hope so. I think so because I'm beginning to see reactions that I hadn't seen 1 or 2 years ago, particularly in the finance sector. Very impressive, the shifts in the finance sector away from high risk assets to much less risky assets. In the political world, yes, also because we now have 70% of global emissions under net zero emission targets for 2050. So that's good news. The bad news is it is 70% and not 100%. And the bad news is it's zero net for 2050 without necessarily putting in a 2030 target. So yes, we're moving generally in the right direction. No, I'm not happy because we're not moving at the scale and speed that we should be.
So that brings me to that whole issue of economic viability that I spoke of, Christiana, that one of the resistances to doing this amongst those who have the power to do anything about it, which is corporations and countries, typically say that, it's just too expensive to do mitigation of climate change. You have been arguing otherwise. So can you lay that out? Like, why would it be economic irrationality not to mitigate climate change? Can you set out some really stark facts that would
let's just take coal, for example, right? Because coal is the most carbon intensive of all of the fossil fuels. And if we were to pick one or the top culprit, let's say the top fuel that is responsible for more climate change disaster than anything else, obviously everything contributes. But if you were to say, okay, what trickles up? It's coal. It's the fact that we've been using coal for the past about 70 years, if not more. And it is the most intensive in emissions when you burn the coal, in addition to being actually quite damaging to individual health when it is being mined. And we know, black lungs, especially in India, even in children, how many children are suffering from black lungs and from asthma and retardation of their brain development, of their lung development as children because of the exposure to coal fumes. So even just on a personal level, individual level, absolutely one of the most deadly contaminants, with more than 8 million deaths per year being directly related to premature deaths, being directly related to the burning of coal and a few other fossil fuels. So we thought last century that coal was a great thing, and it brought a lot of development. And, I'm the first to stand up and thank coal and the other fossil fuels for what they did for the world in the past century. But today, coal is the new asbestos. Coal, we understand that, yes, it has some properties of heat generation, but the fact is that the pain caused and the damage caused by coal way surpasses any of its benefits, way surpasses. And therefore, like we did with asbestos, we just have to get rid of it because it is way too damaging to our human health and to our planetary health. And we know that the cost of renewables, for example, solar in India, is just much, much cheaper than the use even of installed coal. So, there's always a cost of new or versus installed, and installed anything usually is cheaper because it already has made some of the installment purposes, some of the capital expenditures are already incurred. So you say, okay, installed is cheaper than new. But now we are at the point where new, which is usually more expensive, new solar, which many people think is more expensive, is actually cheaper than installed coal. So, we have a complete reversal of costs and of advantages or disadvantages, where frankly, there is absolutely no commercial argument that can be made for coal anymore in any country. It is simply the most contaminating pollutant fuel that there is. And if we didn't have alternatives, we would have to sacrifice 8 million lives a year. But we do have the alternatives. We have the alternatives, and especially India has, this amazing solar resource that can be used, and has the further advantage from the perspective of India that it can be easily distributed. So when you produce energy from coal, you have to have these huge, horrible coal mines polluting. Then you have to take all of that coal to a coal plant, centralized, and produce the energy, then put all of that electricity onto long lines that have to reach out and see how far they can get. But very often they do not get to the far corners of so many millions of people who are still without electricity. And we do have 800 million people around the world that still do not have electricity. Well, that can be solved with renewable energy, because you can take a solar module and put it on top of anybody's little roof. You can put it on the ground. You can put it anywhere. Or you can have these little solar lights that are beginning to be so popular in remote areas in India and elsewhere in Asia, so that you can have electricity completely distributed, disaggregated, that gets to the farthest corner. It doesn't matter how far people live from centralized energy generation, and you can do so without polluting, and you can do so cheaply. So there is frankly no argument to be made for coal anymore.
And just again, speaking about risks, Christiana, and the cost of climate extreme events. So just the pandemic has cost 14 to 15 trillion, the mitigation of the pandemic and the loss of business, economy, loss of earnings. So again, I saw this figure. Tell me if it's a correct projection that if we don't mitigate climate change, it could end up costing 600 trillion, So insurance companies, large corporations, governments, just in terms of the economic threat that climate change is now bringing, they need to sit up as well and see the irrationality of not mitigating it. So is that figure correct, or is it just something?
Yeah. No. I mean, it could be correct depending on how much you include. And the fact is, Shoma, that it could be larger even or smaller. It's a very fluid figure because we don't really know how much damage could occur. That is literally a bottomless pit. So it is very, very dangerous to play irresponsibly with something that could be as devastating as that and as costly and could even go higher. To the contrary, it would only take 1 to 1.5% of global GDP to get us onto a responsible path of climate. And so, you look at those two things and you go like, well, how much are we going to risk here? Not just in terms of financial resources, but frankly, human lives. Are we willing to risk millions of human lives, in addition to human misery, for 1% of GDP, global GDP? I don't think so.
Yeah. So the other report that just came out today, in fact, Christiana, is the Children's Climate Risk Index, which was put out by the UN. And that again has staggering figures of 850 million children are exposed to at least 4 kinds of climate risk. And almost every child in the world is exposed to one or the other, whether it's extreme weather, storm, pollution, flooding, desertification, extreme heat. So all of that. So that brings me, Christiana, to a question I had asked you earlier, which was that one of the things that, the organization you now run is called Global Optimism. And through all of this fairly dark situations, you've constantly struck the note of optimism. And now with the new youth climate movement and this kind of risk to children, do you think that that is going to become a big factor in, say, the climate summit that's coming up in Glasgow in another 2 months?
Well, you see, Shoma, the way I see it, and I haven't had a chance to look at this index, but precisely because of information like that is why we have to stay strong. So for me, let's say optimism is simply the choice to stay strong and have the conviction of saying, right, precisely because it is so consequential. That is the reason why we have to stay strong and stand tall on this. That is not the moment to then fall back and give up. It's just not the moment. This is the moment precisely to stay strong, stand tall, and say, we do have, and we do, Shoma. We have the human ingenuity, we have the technologies, we have the finance, we know what the policies are. Honestly, there's no excuse. There is no excuse for not doing the right thing.
So, that brings me to the whole question of China, America, India, like the big countries that can really make an impact. Are you happy with, say, just individually, the trajectory that China has committed to, starting with China? Because again, I was surprised to hear recently a lot of climate activists, climate interventionists, who are saying that they're starting to feel optimistic about China. But China has set 2060 as its target. And in the meantime, it's given itself the leeway to peak around 2030, 40. Do you think that that's sufficient and are you optimistic about China, or do you feel not enough is being done?
I don't think we've seen yet what China is going to commit to in the short term. If I understand the translation correctly, what President Xi Jinping said was peaking before 2030. And that could mean any year before 2030 and reaching net zero before 2060. So we don't know what that actually means. I don't think they know that yet. I think they're still running those numbers to figure out what they can do. That is currently their position. And obviously, we're all waiting to see what they will bring to the COP in November of this year. I do have to say that my experience with China and climate change is that their tendency, and I've seen this over and over again in history, is to underpromise and overdeliver, which is much more difficult to do in a democracy, by the way, than in a centralized system like China. You can afford to underpromise, and then, because of the centralization of power, overdeliver. Much more difficult to do in a democracy, but that has been traditionally their approach. So I wouldn't, I wouldn't judge the Chinese contribution either, but what they have now on the table, which I think still leaves room for improvement over the past few months. And in fact, even I wouldn't, judge their contribution even with whatever they're going to bring to the COP, although I do think that there are many of us who are expecting an increase in that commitment by the COP.
Just for my audiences, America and India would be the other areas of interest. What is your assessment of where India is and where America is in both awareness, consciousness, and commitment to mitigating this?
Well, in the lead up to Paris, it was very evident that the geopolitical opening that the world saw there was led by a partnership between the United States and China. And given the bilateral relationship that exists right now on so many other issues that are not climate change between the United States and China, I fully respect that both of them have the willingness to collaborate on climate. But I think that they're going to they're going to hit against very closely delineated political boundaries on what they can do with each other. Conversely, I think there's a very, very interesting opportunity for a geopolitical strategy that would be a bilateral relationship between the United States and India. The United States now with a very, very new and healthy attitude toward climate change, and India being the biggest democracy of the world and with leadership that has traditionally been very open to working on climate change for domestic Indian reasons, for example, for health reasons, right? That is the number one reason why India has begun to substitute coal and fossil fuels, either substitute coal in the generation of electricity or substitute liquid fossil fuels for example, in two-wheel transportation that is so popular in India. The fact that India now leads the world on electric motorcycles and with the most innovative business plan or business model for exchanging batteries in those electric motorcycles. That doesn't mean that every motorcycle in India is electric yet, but it's a very interesting incursion into that market. And India, as we know, has chosen for many years not to take on a full economy target like the United States and like China, but rather to do sectoral missions and in different sectors. And that is probably what India will continue to do. That does not exclude a very interesting strategic collaboration with the United States for stepping up and the two of them actually leading respectively the industrialized and the developing world.
So that brings me to corporations, Christiana. You mentioned that you're quite encouraged by a change in psyche in financial sectors, but even in corporations, and you actually did a lot of work with NGOs, corporates, governments, so just if you focus, can you pick a couple of good stories which make one feel that, good things can happen? What do you think about the corporation sector? Is there a really big shift there?
Oh, sorry, Shoma, what do you mean by the corporation sector?
With corporates, I meant, with big businesses.
Oh, I see.
With multinationals.
Yes, I do. I do think that there are impressive shifts. We already have 900 of the largest companies of the world who have committed to themselves to be net zero by 2050 and are putting in place their shorter term targets. We have over 200 companies that have committed to being net zero by 2040, which is 10 years before the Paris Agreement. We have the largest financial institutions, asset owners that are bring together $6.6 trillion among all of them. We have them coming together to say that they will be at net zero by 2050 and currently right now deciding on what their target is going to be for 2025. You will not find a car company in the world that is planning on continuing to produce any vehicle, whether it's 2 wheels, 3 wheels, 4 wheels, or 6 wheels for buses, or 8, that would be fossil fuel led vehicles. You see that they have all established deadlines to move over to either electric vehicles if it's light transport, or perhaps green hydrogen or ammonia, or some other much less polluting fuel if it's heavy transport. So you do have quite a bit of progress and of commitment to change. And again, this is not at all out of a save the world attitude, save the planet attitude. This is all out of self-interest, the car companies, because they know that is where demand is going to come from. They know that the informed population that they sell to wants less emitting vehicles, so they want to get upfront on that. The financial institutions, because they know that the assets that are currently in high carbon are very risky assets and that they're going to lose the value of those assets. We know that the oil and gas companies that are publicly traded have lost anywhere between 30 and 40% of their market value over the past 12 months. So they're becoming stranded. And so, you see more and more corporate movement toward responsibility, not because anybody wants to save the planet. This is not about altruism. This is about very hard-nosed self-interest. And that actually is a powerful motive.
So just last question, Christiana, that we're heading for another big summit in Glasgow. What do you think or what are you hoping it will achieve, and what do you think is the key takeaway that should happen in the summit?
Well, the important thing to understand about the COP in Glasgow is that it is not a COP about reaching agreement among countries. That agreement stands. That's the Paris Agreement. That establishes the trajectory of global decarbonization for the next few decades. So we don't need another big negotiation like we had in Paris. This COP is very, very important, and probably the most important COP since Paris, in that it really tests the efficacy or the efficiency of one of the very important factors of the Paris Agreement, which is that every 5 years, starting with the Paris COP in 2015, that countries would come together and increase their ambition or increase their contribution toward a global solution. And so what is going to be important about Glasgow is to see how many countries will truly come with drastically improved contributions. And we know that the EU has already taken on their 55% cut. So that's what they're going to bring. The United States has doubled under President Biden what they would have done under President Obama. So we know that they're coming forward. And we have most of the G7 countries, not the G20, but in fact, all of the G7 countries have already come forward. We're still waiting for movement from the G20 and from the other countries. So that's what we need to look forward to. How much more can they contribute to this global issue at this very precarious moment in time?
So just there's always a sense that it's for companies or for countries. There's a kind of helplessness at the individual level. So, if you were speaking just to audiences, does individual action count, in the larger scheme? What is it that's doable? That's another phrase that you've been using again and again, that the solutions are so doable, so at an individual level. And speaking of your country, Costa Rica, it's amazing. I believe they're making it legally binding continuity for perpetuity, that there will be no option to ever go back to any carbonization or any use of fossil fuel. So that's pretty radical. It's a country of 5 million people. Will an action like that make impact? And at an individual level, what is it that all of us can do?
Yes, we're currently in that process. It hasn't gone through yet, the law, but the law that is being discussed and that we're very much supporting is a law that would make illegal any exploration or extraction of any fossil fuel ever in the country. So you can imagine that we're quite enthusiastically supporting that law. It hasn't been approved yet, but stay tuned to see. Now, Costa Rica is a tiny little country, as you say, 5 million people and 0.001% of global emissions. So it's not like we cause climate change, nor are we going to solve climate change. But it is a country that punches above its weight because it is a moral voice on this and many other issues, and shows the way to so many other countries. There are actually 100 countries that have the economy the size of Costa Rica in the world, and that have as small emissions profile as Costa Rica, but that constitute a very important part of the demand for clean energy, clean products, and clean services. And the fact is that as we move over to a decarbonized economy, everyone has to move toward that. You can't leave, even these small economies, you can't leave them behind being enslaved to fossil fuels. And I'm not sure how it works in India, Shoma, but in Latin America, we were used to seeing some 10 or 15 years ago that the large medical labs or pharmaceutical companies would use their pharmaceuticals in industrialized countries. And then when it came very close to expiration date, they would quickly move those to developing countries because we didn't pay that much attention to expiration dates. And, we didn't have the luxury to be picky about that. Well, that's not something that we can do with fossil fuels. You can't leave half the world out and say, right, it's the global north that is going to move toward clean technologies and the global south can just stay with their polluting technologies. That's not going to happen. This is a global issue. It's a global challenge and it requires a global response. And so leaving developing countries behind is just unacceptable. And so that's why it is so important to have every country take a look and see how can they contribute, not just because they can contribute to the global issue, but because it's in their interest. It's in their interest. I mean, can you imagine if the global south had been left out, for example, of cellular telephony, and if we were condemned to be using only landlines today? How would our economic development be if all of us in the global south, we only had access to landlines for our, phone system? We know that we did a leapfrogging exercise in the global south, and we jumped over the need to extend those telephone lines to all the corners. And many millions of people in the global south have their little cell phone. Some of them, in fact, even powering them with solar light. And that's the attitude that we have to have. That is exactly the attitude that we have to have about renewables and about these clean technologies. Just leapfrog over all of those outdated technologies that are coming to their expiry date. And we in the global south, we have to reach toward the technologies of the future.
So, I'd asked you that question about individual action.
Sorry. So individual action, yes. So we can all do that as well. And there's several things that are perhaps more germane for industrialized countries, because one of the huge advantages that India has is there is no predominant consumption of meat, especially cattle meat, and beef is just so harmful to our own bodies and to the planet. So I think that's one thing where the world can look to India as a role modeling a much healthier diet that is more plant-based protein than animal-based protein. We can all be much more thoughtful and mindful about our transport and move toward clean transport, for example, in clean motorcycles in India that would clean up the air in cities and make it and decisively bring down the noise pollution, in addition to the air pollution, and make cities much more agreeable. Having much more localized food that we all produce closer to homes is something that we can all move toward. And then, let's be honest, there is a pretty impressive concentration of wealth in some hands in India. Not in many, but in some. And where that wealth is invested is also very important. That wealth should be invested in clean technologies and not in fossil fuel technologies. Because it's better for the country and for the planet, but also for those that have those investments, they don't want to risk having those assets stranded and losing their value. So, whether you own a motorcycle or, some huge, very expensive car, because that's where you are in the socioeconomic strata, everybody can help a little bit.
Thank you very, very much, Christiana. Just being a woman, there's this constant sense that gender justice will improve the world. Personally speaking, and as a rule, how would bringing more women into this impact justice?
What do I bring as a woman? I honestly don't know how to answer that question because I've never aspired to be a man. And I don't know what I would have done if I had been a man. So, difficult to answer that question. What I do read is that we women tend to be more collaborative and more long-term thinkers than our colleagues in the male counterpart. Yes, maybe. I don't know if I had been a male, would I have been equally as collaborative? Maybe. I have no idea. Just because it's difficult to think myself into that space. But having more women in the climate space, especially in the energy space, I constantly look for the presence of women in the energy space. I think there are increasingly more and more women generally in environmental issues and increasingly in climate issues. And I saw that throughout the 6 years that I was at the UN. Since I sit up at the front desk, so to speak, I can see all the participation, and certainly in terms of government representatives and also NGOs that are surrounding the negotiations, I saw a dramatic increase of women, fortunately, which was very, very welcome. But there's one space in which women are still not stepping into, and that would make a huge difference, and that is into energy. It is still a very male-dominated space. And as we understand that energy is no longer this centralized, dominant technology, but rather a very distributed, necessary element in any family's prosperity, especially in those that are farther away, I think women are particularly positioned to be able to push that agenda and ensure that that especially women-led families who don't have men at their sides are actually getting the energy that they need and the electricity that they need. So that would be one space where I would welcome more women.
Thank you very, very much, Christiana. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.